Dead Souls, Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka and other works. Yep, today we're gonna talk about Nikolai Gogol or Nikolai Hohol, and specifically about his attitude towards Ukraine, and about who he really was. Was he a Russian writer or a Ukrainian writer, or was he a collaborator who played into Moscow's hands with a great pleasure? Or did he love Ukraine and consider himself as a Ukrainian? First of all, we must start with the fact that Gogol was born on March 20th or April 1st, according to the modern calendar, of 1809 in the village of Sorchintsy, Mirgorod district, Poltava Governorate, which was then part of the Russian Empire. It means that he was Ukrainian by birth. In fact, his father was Ukrainian speaking. At birth, his surname was Yanovsky. As for his pen names, he was published, for example, under the name of the beekeeper Rudy Panko. A curious fact from Gogol's childhood is that in 1814 he saw a devil for the first time, but young Gogol mistook the devil with a common black cat. In the end, the poor cat was drowned. Speaking of important moments in his biography, it is worth mentioning Petersburg, as that's where he went to show his first poem, Hans Kuchelgarten, which he began writing in Nizhyn, where he studied. Also, he wished to show the poem to Pushkin, who would later become a friend. But at that very moment, Pushkin was in a state of heavy hangover. Eventually, the critics destroy the poem and Gogol burns the whole edition. All these dreams suddenly collapse into dust, and for a living he gets a job as a petty official in the Department of Allotments. Remember that black cat that suffered from little Gogol? It's exactly the one that sends us to Bazaviruk, the first work in the series Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka, where the main character is a devil. And then comes something interesting. It was 1834 when Gogol literally hated St. Petersburg and wanted to move to Kiev. Here is what he wrote back then in a letter to Mikhailo Maximovich, a friend and fellow countryman of Gogol's. Leave Katsapia and go to the Hetmanate. I'm thinking about doing the same and cheap shape of here next year. Truly, we are fools. For what and for whom we are sacrificing everything. Come on, whatever we can find there. Gogol also suffered from the Petersburg climate. He conveys a personal request to the main ideologist of the empire, Uvarov, via Pushkin. He said that if he didn't leave Petersburg, he would die in a month. However, we can recall how exactly Gogol described the Cossacks in the Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka as clumsy little Russians who bowed down to Katka like slaves, while everybody knows about the real relationship between the Cossacks and Catherine Oksana. Cut from the same cloth literally craves whatever is Muscovite, in this case a shoes. By doing so, she devalues everything Ukrainian. Following the theme of the Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka, Gogol also openly puts Ukrainians on the path of inferiority. With this novel, he wanted to show that Ukrainians supposedly cannot live without their so-called older brother, meaning Moscovia. Based on his un-Ukrainian logic, Ukrainians are required to ask permission from Muscovites for everything. This is just plain imperialism. Here we can recall Taras Shevchenko, who on the contrary said, "Keep fighting, you are sure to win." For him, Ukraine should be free and independent of anyone. Shevchenko pointed out the identity and self-sufficiency of Ukrainians, whereas Gogol said completely different things, especially at the end of his life. Besides, we all know how different their position on Moscovia was. Gogol just wanted to leave, but he never did, while Shevchenko had a desire for freedom for Ukraine. By the way, this is not the last mention of Taras Shevchenko in this video. Now let's get back to the life of Nikolai Hohol. The coveted Kiev, the Kiev University of St. Volodymyr, at the Department of General History, Gogol was refused. Instead, he was offered to teach the history of Moscovia. But here, Gogol was the one who refused, and he stayed in Petersburg. Here's some quote about this. "Hell, I would rather take botany or pathology than Russian history. If it were in Petersburg, I would probably take it, because here I am ready to give myself to the boredom twice a week." From Gogol's letter to Maximovich in 1834. Gogol is passionate about the history of Ukraine, and eventually he announces the writing of a major scientific study, the history of Little Russia. This idea isn't very appealing to Muscovites, as it contradicts the official version that Ukraine is exclusively the territory of Moscovia. But in Gogol's work, Ukrainians are a particular nation with democratic traditions, which are opposed to all the mess that is still happening in Moscovia. More than that, Gogol writes a fictional story about Mazeppa, where he glorifies him. And in his historical novel, Taras Bulba, he romanticizes the Ukrainian Cossacks. At this point, Muscovite censorship came on board, and anything that showed Ukraine as separate from Muscovy was forbidden. What is interesting is that in the first edition of Taras Bulba there is not a single mention of a good Russian Tsar. In 1835, Gogol was declared the best writer in Moscovia by the critic Vissarion Bilinsky, who wrote in his review that Gogol exceeded Pushkin, although it should be admitted that there were also some critics who openly and arrogantly advised him to avoid Ukrainian themes, calling it provincialism and hillbillyism. And Gogol did avoid Ukrainian themes in favor of fame. He wrote Vai in that same hated Petersburg. After Vai, he begins to write about Moscovia, which is to say that the devil loses his tail and horns, transforming into a whole country. We mean Moscovia, of course. In 1836, the government inspector was next to be shut down by the censorship, but that wasn't the end of it. Vasil Zhukovsky was able to help personally delivering the government inspector to Nikolai I, who was then the head censor. He not only did not forbid the play, but even ordered to be staged. In fact, he personally visited the premiere of the play. Despite all this, Gogol wasn't satisfied by how the audience understood the government inspector. Rather than thinking, people burst out laughing. Depressed, Gogol left for Italy. In 1842, in Rome, Gogol promises to write a real Muscovite nationalist novel, meaning the second volume of Dead Souls. But to do so, he must mention at least something positive about Moscovia. For the nationalist novel, Gogol receives a fee of 2,500 rubles, but the novel never comes out. Instead, Gogol decides to rewrite Taras Bulba. He criticized Moscovia in the Muscovite emigration community, but this didn't stop him from asking the Tsar for money. Here is what Gogol wrote in a letter to Zhukovsky. If I could have such a board as is given to the pupils of the Academy of Arts living in Italy, or at least such a board as is given to the deacons who are here at our church, I would endure. Find an occasion and a means of pointing out my novels to the sovereign sometime. The Old World Landowners and Taras Bulba. It was then that Taras Bulba became pro-Russian, with phrases about a Tsar who would show everyone his greatness. About the Russian land. In 1844, Gogol received a letter from Petersburg from his female friend Alexandra Smirnova, born in Odessa. She literally demands that Gogol decide on his national identity. Reach the depths of your soul and ask yourself whether you are Russian or a Ukrainian. And Gogol responded nervously, so he wrote to Smirnova, "Am I a saint? Am I able to see all my filth?" But after 2 months, Gogol did respond to Smirnova's question. He wrote that he had two souls, Ukrainian and Muscovite. The Muscovite upper class literally blamed the writer for his excessive attachment to Ukraine, which meant a lack of fondness for Moscovia. In Rome, Gogol renounced all his previous works and became deeply immersed in religion. Writing the second volume of Dead Souls, which was so eagerly awaited in Moscovia, proceeded very poorly. Instead, Gogol writes selected passages from correspondence with friends. For example, in this work he justified serfdom or praised the Muscovite Empire to the point of injuring even the most fierce emperors. The aforementioned critic Bilinsky urged him to visit a doctor. In 1848, he hurriedly left Italy because of the outbreak of revolutions throughout Europe. He is eager to return to Moscovia in the role of a prophet, and for this occasion he plans to republish selected passages from correspondence with friends. Even more, he asks his friend, the artist Ivanov, to complete the painting The Appearance of Christ Before the People, as soon as possible, apparently associating himself with Christ, but this provoked only mockery in Moscovia. His deliberate religiously was also linked to sexual problems. Not much is written about his sexual orientation. Some have suggested that he was gay. Gogol was terrified of women, even to the point of being ridiculous and scary. Once a woman appeared in Gogol's house, he called a priest to bless the place. In 1852, Gogol complains about the depression and about the Moscovite climate, and negatively responds to Taras Shevchenko, saying that he should write in the Moscovite language. However, frankly speaking, at that time, a portrait of Taras Shevchenko hung in every Ukrainian house under an embroidered towel, rushnik. To this day, his portraits hang on the wall of every Ukrainian school. As for Gogol, by all accounts, neither Ukrainians or Moscovites needed him. The Moscovites only use him as a weapon in the war against Ukraine. Now let's look back at the last part of the writer's life. During the fast, Gogol completely refuses to eat. He was getting worse and worse, plus added fear of being buried alive. That's why he spent the last years of his life sleeping half sitting up. There were at least 5 doctors who treated him, not knowing the reason, thus bringing his death closer. He passed away in agony. It happened on February 21st or March 4th, according to the new calendar, of 1852 in Moscow. This was his price for the contract with the devil. And by devil, we mean Moscovite Empire. A curious fact: during Gogol's reburial in 1931, his body was turned upside down in the coffin. Another, no less interesting fact is that the English transcription Gogol's surname was written as Hohol. Why is that? Is that a real attitude towards Ukraine, or did Gogol really love Ukraine? It's hard to say, because the writer wanted recognition and was forced to dance to the tune of the Moscovites. Besides, there are theories about his mental illness, which was later called Gogol's disease. It seems that he is a man of controversy. He calls Moscovite history boring, while requiring Shevchenko to write only in the Moscovite language. He urged to leave Moscovia, but later he basically falls on his knees to the empire. So, how do you think Gogol really felt about Ukraine? Write your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to share this video, and if you are able, support our project financially. Your donations help us to create content, among other things.